So welcome to Answer Time, the new discussion show from the team at Reaction. Thank you first to our sponsors. Answer Time is in association with NatWest Group, and this supports our student program at Reaction, which is providing training and opportunities for brilliant young journalists who work with us. Answer Time is a discussion show with a difference. It's an attempt to have a constructive discussion or debate on the issues that matter. This launch edition, and there are going to be 3 more from January and February, just about to be announced, is a review of 2020 and what a year it's been. And our guests will also, you'll be glad to hear, look forward to next year and prospects for recovery. We have a fantastic lineup of guests for you. Sir Lynton Crosby, election guru, Right Honourable Caroline Flint, former MP and Labour Minister, Justin Webb, the BBC Radio 4 Today programme presenter, and Seb Burnside, Chief Economist for NatWest Group. Now, I'm going to kick off by asking each of you, when you first realised that this COVID-19 thing was going to be such a consequential development and such a massive story. Justin?
I think it was March the 14th, maybe the 15th, Today programme studio. We've still got people coming in, they're still shaking hands, having a bit of a laugh, all bit slightly gallows humour, feeling that things were getting quite serious, looking at what's going on in Italy. And Sir Patrick Vallance, chief scientist, 8:10 interview, and it's thoughtful and grave. And about halfway through, we begin to talk about herd immunity and what that actually means. And I ask him what it means, and he explains. And it becomes obvious that there is at least the possibility, not only that large numbers of people might contract this, but that actually at the moment the government didn't have a better view of what should or ought to happen. And it was kind of one of those moments where you just think, my goodness, I mean, he's a very open and amenable guy, Patrick Vallance. You see him at press conferences now, but actually in his one-to-one interviews, he really wanted the nation to engage. He felt it was a serious moment, and he was there with serious intent. But I was getting text messages. You know, we get texted during the program quite often by people, you know, and a couple of quite senior people, politicians, texted me saying, my goodness, I can't believe what I've just heard. And when he went, we immediately turned to each other and thought, my goodness, this is quite something. And kind of in a small way as well. How much longer are we going to have people coming into the studio? How much longer are we going to be able to meet face to face? How much longer are we going to be shaking hands with guests? So that for me was the moment.
Caroline Flint, what was your experience? When did it first dawn on you?
I think it was sort of early on in March, as we had sort of almost had a sort of pseudo situation in terms of what was happening. But I think when the reports came, they were interviewing the gentleman who contracted the virus, and he'd been on holiday in northern Italy on a ski holiday, and suddenly more information about the number of Brits who were in that particular part of Italy and what we knew was already happening there. It really sort of came home to me. And I should just say as well is that I remember as public health minister in the sort of mid-2000s being briefed by people about bird flu and getting ready for that. And it's interesting hearing people like Professor David Salisbury talking about vaccination now. He was advising me at the time about what we could do in terms of vaccines. And I think what I took away from that back then, and I think it's clearly the case today, if government thinks it's acting fast, it should be going faster, because the way this spreads is just beyond, I think, what we can imagine. So if you're ever thinking you're going fast enough, you are just not going fast enough. You have to act quicker. I think that's the lesson learned this year.
Lynton Crosby, was the arc of the story different in Australia? When did it occur to you? I should explain, thank you for getting up at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning and joining us from Australia.
Well, my pleasure to. Well, it's not my pleasure, but I'm willing to do it. It's our 42nd wedding anniversary. My wife's still in bed. I might survive to 43rd, but you never know. Mine is a human sort of recollection, really, because I was at a mate's daughter's wedding, which we'd come out to Australia for. Thank God, to be honest. And it was on the weekend that Justin mentioned, and around the weekend, the dates that Justin mentioned. And I was about to fly back to the UK immediately after the wedding, and my wife was going to stay for some family events. And it was one of those things. On the way out, she said, "You sure you'll be able to go back?" And I said, "Don't be ridiculous. Everybody's overreacting." And by that weekend, it was clear that this was getting serious. And within a day, the wedding I attended was the last of the weddings that were able to be held for the year almost. So it's actually the personal impacts like that I think really bring it home to you, because suddenly we're being advised against traveling. So we're in Australia and suddenly don't go back, don't fly out of the country, and no more weddings. And that really brought it home, because it's that interruption to everyday life that underscores, crikey, this might be serious.
Seb, how was it for you?
Yeah, so conforming to type as an economist, I think that the market signals were the ones which really brought it home to me. In 15 trading days, the FTSE lost 30%, and that makes events that previously you would have described as being sharp shocks, like the financial crisis, look like some very long, drawn-out kind of novel compared to the severity with which coronavirus grabbed people's attention. And really our sort of interest then pivoted to a bit like Justin was saying, what on earth is it that you can do to mitigate or stop this? And the fascinating but also terrifying analysis of, well, how much of the economy, how much of people's lives do you have to shut down in order to make a meaningful impact on these hugely exponential processes, which we've played around with in some aspects of modeling and forecasting, but this really was a power and a force when it was unmitigated that we haven't come across in much of our analysis. So yeah, that was the point of sort of maximum wow factor, and particularly when we then got to the policy responses, breaking totally new ground as to what we can do when we put our mind to it.
Yeah, I have to say, and I as a journalist, I can't often claim foresight, but my date of realization was actually much earlier. And no, I didn't necessarily write this at the time, but I remember it clearly because it was Brexit night, and it was the 31st of January, and people were joking. I was at a drinks party, and people were joking about the prospects of the virus. And someone asked Matt Ridley, Lord Ridley, who is a biologist by training, almost in a jocular fashion, is this serious? And he didn't respond in a jokey fashion. He said, they're not sure if it's the one, but it might be, which put a complete dampener on the sort of next few minutes of the party. Of course, then my expectation after that was that, and we'll come on to government responses in a second, was that maybe I put too much faith in government at the time, and throughout sort of February and March, I thought they're following the science line, sounded credible, and then you discover in the middle of March, had a realization, a bit like Justin's, just how serious it was. How do you think the government has handled it? Caroline, you mentioned being public health minister. How would you rate? Let's talk about the UK first. The UK government response.
I think, to be honest, whoever would have been in government, if Labour had won the election, which obviously didn't happen, but I think anyone would have found this hard to deal with. And I think part of the reason for that, I think it's exposed some real problems in the way we run our health service. I think the idea that we actually have a Department of Health and Social Care that is integrated is nonsense. It's quite clear. And there might be some very good reasons for this, but I think it's really exposed the gulf between the NHS and the focus on that, understandably, and the lack of focus on social care, particularly those within our care homes. And maybe later on we'll talk about lessons learned. If there's any lessons learned from this, that's an area of public policy that really has to be addressed. It was an afterthought. And whilst on one hand, I think some of the really positive things that happened, NHS collaboration, I've talked to some health professionals who said it's advanced the use of technology in the NHS by probably 5 years in some regards, with GPs using video appointments and everything else, which has been amazing. Amazing. It's taken this to do that, but it's amazing. The furlough scheme, I mean, the fact that a Conservative government would very much use everything the state can do when you need big state to get a job done, the furlough scheme, support for businesses, just shutting down the economy and stepping in. I think, you know, there's been some good stuff out of that, but I have to say, there has also been panic too. If you look at what is exposed in terms of the fact that most of our relatively low-grade manufacturing has been outsourced overseas, and therefore, along with other countries, we were fighting over getting hold of masks and gowns, and in the process ended up with maybe not the greatest quality, is a really good example of the weaknesses it's exposed as well as the strengths. So I think the government has done well in some areas. I think where it has failed is during periods when there was time to think. It doesn't seem to have thought about the right issues. The exam debacle was an example of that. They knew that was coming down the road. I'm not saying it was going to be easy, but when it arrived, it just seemed that they hadn't really thought it through. And that lack of thinking through in education, in social care, I think has been a real weakness during this particularly difficult time.
Lynton Crosby, you advise organisations on crisis management, among other things. What were the main challenges then, specifically in the UK, but we can talk internationally as well, for those trying to deal with the crisis? And how did you judge the UK response looking in from abroad?
Well, the first thing to say about times of crisis, we've done a lot of work on this over the years, just from a polling and understanding how people think about it. At a time of crisis, the public's confidence comes from competence, not from, grand pronouncements or anything like that. They want to know what's going on. They want you to explain what's going on, and they want to know that you've got a plan to deal with it. And the confidence that the public has comes from knowing that you're working to a plan, and therefore, even if things are difficult, there's a basis on which, or a framework that you're using to deal with the problems that you face. And, I think that's been a challenge in the UK, frankly. We do a tracker that we look at public opinion in 6 countries as to different aspects of the pandemic. And in terms of whether the government is handling it favourably or unfavourably, or well or poorly, the net position in Australia is plus 66. So 66% more people think the government is handling the pandemic well than poorly. In the UK, that's minus 13. So there's a sense that amongst the public that it hasn't been well handled based on this research. You can't draw a judgment about what that means ultimately, because people are giving. Caroline, I think, basically said this. People want governments to succeed. That they are willing you to do a good job. So they're not sort of politically judgmental at this time. They want to know what's going on. What are you doing about it? How should I think about it? And I think one of the challenges in the UK has been there's been some chopping and changing, some confusion on occasion, and of course it's a massive challenge in Europe in particular. Interestingly, in Australia, we had very significant bushfires at the start of the year. You probably all recall that. And the Australian Prime Minister got into quite a bit of trouble because he went on holidays during the early stages of that crisis. And people said, where's the national leader? What's he doing? And traditionally, it had not been the case that the national leader managed bushfires, because that was done by our states. But I think he benefited from that experience. He saw that the public expect their national leaders to step up and really take control and chart a pathway forward. And that's the key. You can talk, quite rightly, you can talk about whether the NHS and Public Health England and all these bodies are properly equipped for this sort of challenge. And I think the civil service has been exposed somewhat in that people thought Britain had this great civil service, but it's a great civil service if you've got time to plan. It's not so easy when you're facing an immediate challenge that you have to deal with. So for me, the key test for a government is, can it demonstrate competence? Because it's only through demonstrating competence that people have confidence and therefore will listen to what you say. And the longer it goes on, if people think, well, they said this, then they said that, now they're saying something else, why should I listen? Then that's really when you start to have problems.
But ultimately, though, Lynton Crosby, it comes down to the politicians, doesn't it? What happened in February and March in the UK wasn't helped by everyone getting sick as well, but there did seem to be a slowness to respond. And I confess at the time I didn't really see it. I thought people were overreacting.
That's my point, though. I don't. Yes, of course, it comes down in part to leadership and to politicians, but the great British civil service maybe not quite as great as you think it is, because it has, it takes leadership, obviously at the top, but frankly, this is what they're paid for, to get a grip of these situations and to ensure that you endure. And frankly, and there's no doubt that you've got amongst the best doctors and nurses and so forth in the world. But I do think that there's been, it's not just about political leadership, it's about leadership across the civil service. It's about bringing the country together. So in Australia, Scott Morrison set up a group of people, leaders in business and industry and logistics and all of those things right at the start. Everything was done at the start. There was a national cabinet cabinet put together right at the start, where the equivalent would be the leader of Scotland, Wales, and so forth would come together. All the leaders of all of our states, whatever political persuasion, came together right at the start, and so they put a process in place that helped them more effectively, perhaps, manage the situation.
Yeah, good plan. But it didn't happen just in the UK. And you interview cabinet ministers and public health officials. What's your take on why there was that period in February and March? It's only really, as you said, the 14th of March that we all wake up.
Yeah.
Very few people had been alert to it before then. What went wrong politically?
I think part of it is going to be, when we have our grand inquiry into all of this, is going to be a structure of government thing, which Lynton's touched on. But I think, what is the Cabinet Office? Where is it? Where is the power in it? What is its ability to pull a lever and for the lever not to kind of come off in someone's hands? I'm old enough to have, at least as a student, studied the Central Policy Review staff, the Heath thing in the early 70s, where they kind of tried to organize some way of getting to grips with actually making things coherent at the center of government. And, I think it may be that one of the lessons we're going to learn is that we have to kind of reorganize the way in which the kind of joined upness of government actually works. And it also was very obvious to us as reporters on all of this that what we were being told, if not on air, but behind the scenes, when those scenes in Italy were playing out, was, that's not going to happen here. For various reasons that, frankly, and I think, it's our responsibility and extent. I'm not sure we pressed hard enough on why it wasn't going to happen here, but there was this sort of sense, this almost sort of visceral sense that that what was going on there couldn't happen here, but the reasons, the kind of the causes of the difference between us and them weren't clear and weren't really properly explored, I don't think. So I think there were kind of failures all round on that. But I do think the structure and also the confusion just politically, because nobody knew who was coming from where. I mean, it was very, I don't know what the case was in Australia, Lynton, but here, I mean, when you look across at the States, I had a friend coming from America, a left-wing friend, guy who lives in San Francisco, a big Obama supporter, and I said, well, you're not obviously not going to come now. This was in early March, and he said, it's all made up. It's all made up by the right wingers. And there was this complete kind of sense of you think what's happened, particularly in America, where that kind of complete change now. But to an extent here, I'm not sure who thought what or thought what was being made up. There was this kind of confusion politically because this wasn't the kind of thing that fitted into a normal kind of political or Brexit or all the rest of it. It didn't kind of fit into tram lines that we got used to being in. And for all those reasons, I'm not sure that we were asking the right questions.
Yeah. Caroline, you worked with Blair and Brown on the Boris question and the leadership question. Do you think a different prime minister would have handled it differently? I mean, it's possible to imagine, isn't it? Margaret Thatcher, as a chemist and with a sort of scientist brain, really latching onto the story very early and being concerned about it. I can imagine Gordon Brown taking an interest. But was there something about Boris's personality that means that he responded in the way he did, do you think?
Well, I mean, it's hard to judge that because, I mean, it goes to Justin's point. Until we know more at some future date about what might have been said in certain government departments that then didn't get pushed up, if you like, to the top of government and who heard that, it's really hard to judge that in a way. So, but it might be the case that we do discover down the road that there were warnings, there were voices trying to be heard, and, you know, not only the civil service, but the political structure wasn't engaging with that in the way it should. I mean, obviously, the other factor in all of this is Boris Johnson got COVID. Mm-hmm. And you know, with the best will in the world, he was in hospital like many other people. And therefore, again, what happens when the lead person, as Lynton describes it, isn't able to take part? What I think we have seen, and I sort of judge this from half, but my sense is that whatever sort of assurances or whatever Boris Johnson's maybe less than as serious as it might have been views at the start of this, I think we have seen a massive change in his attitude to this. And also with that, the attitude of how his party and government should respond to this in terms of using the power of the state, which has not made him popular at all on his own benches. I think it has woken him up to very much, you know, the heavy lifting, the seriousness of what you have to do when you face this sort of crisis. And it will be very interesting to see next year and beyond that, what that will mean for him in terms of his future in politics, on a personal level, but also on a party level in terms of the Conservatives.
Lynton Crosby, you worked with Boris Johnson for a long time. Is this going to, as Caroline suggested there, a really interesting way of looking at it, that it's changed him, or it's going to change what kind of prime minister, person and politician he is?
As I said, you know, Scott Morrison had the experience of being criticised over how he handled another crisis, and that, I think, made him reflect on how he would handle any future crisis. And in the same way, I think, yes, of course it will, and it would any leader, because it would really bring home the significance and the responsibility associated with the task of being prime minister, and make you realise just how much is in your hands, how much responsibility is in your hands. I think it will. I'm sure it will, as it would, you know, virtually any human being. And he's not, you know, it's to your point about, you know, who would you instinctively look to handle a crisis like this. You know, he wouldn't have thought that he'd have to face something like this, and a lot of the public would. We think that they'd be looking.
Yeah, I think Lynton's frozen there, but we're going to come on. That leads us on to talking about the coming back. Seb, let's talk about. We're going to consider some of the impacts. Let's talk about the economy, UK and global. This is like the experience of the last year has been like nothing any of us have ever experienced. Put it into the economics of it. Put it into historical context for us.
Yeah, so it's very challenging to do even that. The simplest comparisons you can make, classic exercise of how far do you have to go back to see this sort of impacts on outputs, takes you well into the 300 years mark, and some what's sort of faintly amusing to read about now, but must have been horrific at the time, periods where you had frost wipe out agricultural seasons across Western Europe, and these kind of hits to the economy that we saw earlier in the year, but will ultimately add up towards the end of the year. At its worst point in April, we had about a quarter less going on in the economy than we had a couple of months before, and that was at the direction of government, plus people's own behavioural responses to the virus. I think the really astonishing thing is how quickly some of that has come back. Caroline mentioned the furlough scheme. That had 9 million people on it at its peak point. So the state literally stepping in and paying the wages of 9 million extra people. We've had the Bank of England printing £1 million a minute for the vast majority of this year, giving the government the ability to just spend without consideration of what is happening on the other side of its accounts. And that has frankly got us to a place today where there are more people in work than we expected there to be in March and April, despite there still being 2 million people on the furlough scheme. There are fewer businesses that have failed through this crisis because government-backed lending schemes from the banks have meant that 25% more debt has got out to businesses to allow them to see them through to the point at which they can make money. And I think everyone has learned a lesson about the effectiveness when you take a kind of a total approach to policy, to do as much as you can and bridge people over what ultimately will have permanent effects, but what's overwhelmingly in the first instance was a temporary impact to get through to some.
Do you think, Seb, that the commentators who say that we should be relaxed about that extraordinary spending and money printing, for want of a better term, because the government is able to borrow now at exceptionally low rates, and that's true across the West, that we should be relaxed about that? Or is there a point, and I always think this about economic crises, that the reason why they start is usually it's only apparent to a few people beforehand, and then afterwards, when the shock hits, people say we should have been worried about X, Y, or Z. Should we be worried about what this is doing to national debt, and is there scope for interest rates to rise substantially?
I think the point to be worried is not yet, because there is far more that could be lost by pulling away those supports at this stage than risked by continuing with that support. There is still a huge amount of unknowns about where we go next. We're about 8 or 9% below where we were output-wise, so we've still got a financial crisis size plus a little bit gap to close. On optimistic forecasts on upsides, the OBR, Office of Budget Responsibility, published a month ago, you could close all of that gap by Q3 next year, which would be phenomenal. Or on pessimistic outcomes, you're left with a permanent 5% gap to wait for. So with that on the table, you have to gamble and say, let's try and close as much as possible and see where we get to.
Yeah, I have to say I tend to the optimistic side on this in terms of the V-shaped thing. I just think the impact of vulnerable groups being vaccinated pretty much completely by February, just the sort of pent up demand and just energy, I think, is going to do extraordinary things this spring. But we'll see. In terms of other areas of impact, Justin, we always ask about politics, but let's talk just for a second on media. We talk a lot in the media about trust and trust in politicians, and we know what trust levels are like in journalism in general at the moment. How do you think our trade, and that's very broad term, running for broadcasters through print, through websites, how is the media done in reporting this, particularly in the UK?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I think initially there was a kind of, it was a good crisis for the BBC, because people wanted the kind of thing that the BBC has traditionally done, which is not to get out in front particularly, not to campaign, but actually to be dependable and to be there. And that's kind of the traditional role of the BBC. And I think people did rally round and did want it to happen. I think though it's brought to the fore a kind of broader discussion about information, truth, facts that was anyway swirling about and has been swirling about in the Trump world, but now is kind of right forward and center, the extent to which we want to go down the road. And this is, I don't ask this in the sense of a warning one way or the other, but it's an interesting discussion, which I think it has kind of, as in so many areas of life, it's accelerated something that was anyway there. But this business of how do we want to get our news? To what extent is it ridiculous in the future to have broadcasting hamstrung in the way it is hamstrung legally in the United Kingdom from being fully opinionated? To what extent actually is it now quite opinionated in certain corners without it being particularly hugely regulated? Yeah. How does the BBC fit into that? All these questions are kind of swirling there, are kind of brought into much greater relief by what's happened. And I obviously, I'm not in a position to be able to come to any conclusions about it, but I do think there is a real discussion now in the wake of COVID about the extent to which people can still get reliable information, but perhaps with a political spin or with an opinionated spin, and feel comfortable with that. And that, of course, is a decision, genuinely is a decision for the nation to make, but it can make it now in the light of an event where we had quite a lot of spins of various sorts and a lot of disinformation that is still out there. And you look on Twitter and you see people's recourse to things that are very, very far from the BBC. But does that necessarily mean that people kind of rally around and say, no, we definitely need to have the same structure of broadcasting that we've had for the last several decades? Obviously not. But it does, as I said, it brings into relief, it seems to me, a whole set of questions about not just about broadcasting and not just about journalism, but just about how people understand things.
Yeah, I think one of the worst things that happened to journalism during the crisis were the live televised press conferences, which the public, the punters, absolutely hated generally. They liked briefings from the medics and the scientists, who were sometimes you could make a case for saying we're making questionable claims, but they had trust there, but they were then, and Lynton's a veteran of this, and Caroline's been on many political programs and been cross-examined. You then had this spectacle of tens of millions of people, because the audiences were initially huge, seeing how the process works. And it's a bit like, you don't want to sort of see how the sausage is made, is that the questions which are asked can sound like daft questions, or they can sound needling, but they're designed, and I don't want to be too, it was a difficult thing to do on Zoom, asking people in the early days of the crisis to go, to ask the Prime Minister or Chris Whitty questions. but it certainly, it wound up the public, just thought that it was sort of gamesmanship, or or showmanship rather. And actually it's how journalists advance the story in a small way, or try and get a concession or an admission, or try and sometimes just the politician plays with the dead bat. But it looked terrible on television, and I'd imagine as a politician, former politician, Caroline, you rather enjoyed it.
Well, I sort of found myself on just a personal level, and I don't know if this speaks to other people's experience in the country. I mean, we personally suffered a huge loss at Easter, losing my mother-in-law. And I have to say, some of the things the politicians were saying, some of the things that was being reported by media about the care homes and hospitals, because she went through all of that, it almost became too painful to even start to carry on watching it, because it was just making us upset and very annoyed. And I think that probably speaks to the story of many families. But what I found, well, on one level, thank God for, parts of broadcast and print journalism, because quite frankly, some of those graphs that were being put up at these press conferences, they were so confusing that you needed the media, whether it's the BBC or Sky or the broadsheets or tabloids, to actually put it into plain English that people could understand. Because I have to say, there were some of those press conferences just left people scratching their heads about what they were actually trying to tell us and what the information was telling us. The thing is, the country would expect the Prime Minister, the leaders, the chief experts to have those sort of events. Some, let's be honest, were better than others, but we needed other people to help express that and communicate that, to reinforce the messages. And, I think, whilst holding them to account and questioning them, I think, parts of our establishment in terms of journalism, to offset what was being said on social media, which some of it was absolutely ridiculous, was really vital and continues to be vital. Now,
so last question on COVID, and then we're going to move on to another couple of topics. But Lynton Crosby, you obviously you love the media. What did you make of it? No, he's missed it. He's missed his chance.
Some journalists are friends of mine. I think actually it exposed the media, because more and more people were watching, particularly broadcast, and had for a long time, and they just wanted to draw their own conclusions and listen to their leaders. And as I said,
well, he's been cut off there.
Judgments. Sorry.
No. Let's move on to not everything's about the damned virus this year. Let's talk about some other big themes. Not too much on Brexit, but a bit on the politics of Brexit. Is there going to be a Brexit deal, and what does it look like? And I'll ask you first, Caroline. It feeds into Labour and how Labour are doing. How should Keir Starmer handle it?
If a deal comes back, I think he should support it. I think a deal is going to happen. I didn't expect it to happen much before the deadline, because why would you want to leave space for either people in the UK to say it's bad, or for that matter in the EU, people to say we're not happy about how much we've got to concede there. So you want to leave as little time as possible for people to get their claws into these things. But I think a deal will happen, and I think Keir should support it, because he's made it very directly since he became leader that if he should be Prime Minister, he's not going to reopen a campaign to go back into the EU. By supporting a deal, it allows him to move on and take Labour forward and focus on some other things. He can't change the outcome, not with the majority that there is in Parliament. And I think, he needs to find another story about himself that is away from the connection he had to all the Brexit politics of the last few years.
How do you think he's doing in that regard?
Well, I think I think he's actually doing as best he can, but I think let's be clear. He is dealing within the Labour Party with a number of different fronts. both in terms of, you know, the sort of hard left that are still there and want to cause him problems. There's various online accounts which is about getting rid of Keir from within some people who claim to be in the Labour Party. And on the other side, even amongst moderates who would not be happy with him being so definitive about accepting Brexit. But this goes to leadership. And for the Labour Party, and this isn't anything new that I've said before many, many times, is you have to make your mind up whether you're just going to be a party that makes your members happy or one that actually speaks to the country. And for too long now, in the last few years, it's been about a very internalised debate and not one that's looked outwards. And I think Keir wants to do that. But nobody's really listening to the Labour Party at the moment. I'm sorry to say that, because we've got other things on our mind, the pandemic being one of them. But at the point at which people will turn to the opposition and want to hear what Keir Starmer says, he can deal now with getting rid of some of the baggage that gets in the way of having that conversation, and Brexit is one of them.
Lynton Crosby, what should Boris and the Tories do after Brexit? Sort of assuming now that there is going to be a deal of some description in the next week or so.
The key thing is, you know, coming out of once you're through the pandemic, whenever that is, it's about the economy, and so the government needs to refocus very much on the economy and show how they're building a stronger economy, which will secure jobs and opportunity for families by taking advantage, giving a lot of focus on the advantages they're exploiting as a consequence of Brexit. Otherwise, there's a mismatch between the promise that they talked of and the reality. So, big economic focus and really make Brexit and the things that they're doing post-Brexit integral to that.
Seb Burnside, is that feasible? What does Brexit look like economically? Because as quite a lot of Brexit supporters, would argue that it compared to COVID, it's a sort of dent that's going to be lost, in the story of 2020-21. But do you think it's done sort of long-term serious harm, or are there some opportunities as well?
There are opportunities. I think they are outweighed by the headwinds to growth that the greater frictions to trade will present. But those headwinds are not insurmountable. And in the context of the crazy volatility we've gone through this year, and hopefully the very strong growth that we'll have in the context of the vaccine availability next year, then I don't think it will be an identifiable feature on people's minds as long as the kind of logistical issues are ironed out in the first point. I think the real opportunity next year for growth is to get on with creating as many opportunities for the younger people who generally are losing out more from COVID, and for doing so in a way which is consistent with building the infrastructure and the capability that we need to transition to a net zero economy. And I think that's...
Do you see much sign, Seb, that the government or the authorities grasp yet that what's needed is as well as infrastructure spending, what's needed is a real burst of enterprise and trying to encourage people to start businesses and retraining? And if it's there, I don't really see it or hear it from the government.
I think it's I think the understanding of it is there. I think we're not yet in a position to kind of hit go on that button, and therefore, we've got an incredibly difficult few months to get through. And so it's totally understandable if, ideal world, you would want those plans laid out for you now, so that you know what will be in the budget in March or April time. But we've still got an incredibly difficult period to get through before we get there. The good thing is that on lots of those agendas, there are a phenomenally large amount of fantastic analysis and proposals being made. So the civil service and the politicians won't be short of great ideas to choose between when they are in a position to really get going on it.
Do you think that the budget that you mentioned there there's going to be a tussle, isn't there, between some Treasury hawks saying, well, now is the moment. Look, you're closing the gap faster than expected, as you mentioned earlier. Now's the moment for a bit of retrenchment, rein in on some of the spending. And the Prime Minister loves to spend, particularly on grand projects. And then that strand of opinion, parts of the Tory party, which is very much the sort of, hesitate to use the word Thatcherite, but very much about enterprise, all of that sort of stuff. So there's a big economic discussion to be had this spring, isn't there?
There is, and I think the common ground between those two positions is as you put it, support for enterprise and creating jobs for those who have been most adversely affected. Because COVID's very cruel medically, it's been pretty cruel economically as well. Whenever there's been weakness, vulnerability, financially or otherwise, those are the people who've suffered the most. We see that in terms of our own customer behaviour. The more affluent customers have seen their balances increase because their inability to spend has been a bigger factor than any hit through income. Whereas those lower down the income spectrum have had the opposite. They've been more likely to be furloughed, more painfully affected by loss of earnings, and not benefit from the same savings. So I think if you can help those people with more opportunities, then you can hopefully have a coalition of agreement.
Right. Let's talk Trump and the US. Justin, you know the US inside out. What does the Biden era have in store? Actually, maybe you want to talk firstly about the election, because I was going to ask Lynton about. I'd gone into it, expecting pre-COVID to be there and writing about it, but I had gone into it because of what happened in the summer, actually thinking that Trump was in with a pretty good shout, and that there was enough happening that would motivate his base. But in the end, he lost by quite a bit. What did you make of that final run in? Did he blow it? Justin,
is that for me? Yeah. Yeah. I think he did. I think he did blow it. And I agree with you. I think he was in a relatively strong position. And even as late on as when he contracted COVID and had that kind of extraordinary appearance back at the White House and all the rest of it, there is a strong constituency of people to whom that will have really appealed, and actually did appeal. And the polling seems to suggest that particularly Hispanic men were quite attracted to the kind of machismo, that kind of sense of strength that he always tries to display. So I don't think he lost it then. I think I think that the erratic sense of the Trump endeavor was always going to be a problem for him, and I think he allowed it at that kind of crucial moment to come to the fore, and that will have done for him. I mean, you say in the end he lost pretty handily, and I suppose he did, but in 2 or 3 states, actually, it's tens of thousands of votes, really, isn't it, that were the difference. And you can see circumstances where even in those late days, he could have managed it. He could have turned it round. As to what happens next, I mean, my goodness, a lot obviously depends on what happens in the Senate on January the 5th, it is, isn't it, where they have these 2 special elections, these 2 runoff elections in Georgia, and if the Democrats can win both of them, then they have the Senate with the help of the vice president's casting vote, and you can then, I think, build. I mean, it'd be interesting what Lynton thinks and what Caroline thinks about this. Do you want to be completely in control if you're Joe Biden, or actually do you really want, given the vociferous nature of his party, do you really want them to be saying, look, we can do whatever we want at this stage, or do you actually want to lose those and have a kind of mixed government? But on the other hand, if you have that, if you have the Republicans still in control of the Senate. The first time that's been the case for an incoming president, where the other party has control of the Senate since George H.W. Bush. So, back in 1989. So you've got this real kind of sense of actually politically, it's still being completely up in the air where America is. And we have to wait until January the 5th for that. And then in the longer term, if Biden is, by long term, in the next few months, if Biden is back in charge and relatively able to do things, I just wonder, it's kind of the old guards, a bit of Obama stuff. There's some, it's as if Trumpism hasn't happened. And I just wonder the extent to which the nation has moved on. Obviously, the Republican Party has moved on. We might want to talk about that in a second, but the nation has moved on in a way that just going back to the old way of doing business and having these kind of Ivy League chappies coming back in. They are mainly chaps who work for Obama et al. And just going back to that kind of sense of an America where neither big party had the interests of the middle class, what we would call the working class, in their sights. Neither party had it. Trump managed to speak a language that appealed to a group of people. Most of them, frankly, stuck with him. And that is a situation where just the kind of going back to Obama Mark III or back to, Biden Mark II or 3 or 4 or whatever, it just doesn't fix it, I don't think. So in other words, I suppose what I'm saying is a bumpy ride, where they potentially lose the House in a couple of years' time, and the presidency just kind of goes into nothing. I'm not predicting that will happen, but that is an obvious threat, I think, that Biden's people are going to have to be dealing with right now.
It's that fascinating thing, isn't it, with American politics, that as soon as you're finished one cycle, the next begins. So it's really moving in sort of 18-month, 2-year spans. And I'm just going to ask, I'll come to you in a second, Caroline, Lynton Crosby, how do you think the Republicans, obviously defeated in unusual circumstances, do you think that are they in trouble, or are they actually rather handily set up for what comes next?
Well, firstly, I want to say I agree with everything Justin said. It's unusual for me to agree with everything somebody from the BBC said, but I do. And I think
I don't know whether it'd be more damaging for you or me, Lynton.
I think he's right on the money. I think the problem is you've got, I think on the Biden side, it's a bit of what Caroline spoke about with Keir Starmer. That is, Biden's got this now sort of motivated left wing that is already unhappy with some of his appointments. So he's going to be attacked from the left for not being as aggressive on their agenda as possible. And then on the right, you've got the risk with the Senate, but you've got something more than that. You've got Trump has created a new coalition. I mean, there's the Republican Party, and then there's the Trump tribe, and they're still out there. You see them, on Pennsylvania Avenue and so forth, saying the election was stolen. 77%, I heard on a poll yesterday, of Republicans think that the election was fraudulently won. So, this division remains, and I hate to keep using Australian references, but John Howard, the former Australian Prime Minister, had a great line in describing Donald Trump at one of these inevitable election seminars, which was he lacked the public grace required of a national leader, and his failure to display that public grace, that sense of leadership, has kept alive the anger and frustration of this Trump tribe. Now, a lot of those people have every reason to be angry, as they've seen, one rule for the technology moguls of the United States and another rule for punters on the minimum wage trying to earn a living and look after their families. But that's still there, and I think I agree completely with Justin. I don't see that there's a pathway forward from the division and the sort of moribund nature of things, and returning to the now the Democrat establishment is not going to solve things either.
Caroline, do you feel more optimistic from the Biden perspective?
I think Joe Biden was, I think others have said this, was the right candidate at the right time. Not the perfect candidate, but the right candidate at the right time. And clearly he, offset complaints from some of his party to reach out into those Rust Belt areas to regain their trust. And part of it is regaining trust. The question is that going to be sustainable down the road, as Lynton's alluded to? Because Trump may not come back as a candidate. Who knows what he might do? But Trumpism is still there. And the underlying causes for its popularity and discontent with the sort of establishment in Washington is still out there. I mean, America, I know we talk about, how politics is polarized here in the UK, and certainly in recent years, certain subjects like Brexit have demonstrated that. But America is, I think, a far more polarized society than ours. And part of the challenge for Biden is whether he can deal with what he's got to deal with in his own party, but also try and find some consensus across the divide. I think 126 Republican representatives backed the Texan legal challenge. Thank goodness. And, that is worrying. Given the legal grounds for that challenge. But if Biden can reach out to some Republicans to find some consensus, that is the most we can hope for at the moment. What happens out of that, I really don't know.
Though I do wonder, Caroline, whether the Republican establishment, McConnell, for example, to what extent they're playing along with that, knowing that they want to have deniability to, someone called them the Trump tribe, don't they? They want to be able to say, look, we were with him every step of the way. Maybe. So you're right. Morally, it doesn't make
at that point. I think it's much deeper than that, and I think Lynton's quite right. There is a Republican Party still, and there is the Trump Party. But actually, the Trump Party is way the more powerful. I wrote something the day of the election saying the biggest loser in the whole thing was Jeb Bush, meaning that it's the kind of the old country club Republicans are stuffed now. That kind of sense that the party could just go back to being internationalist, low tax, low spend. That to me, as an onlooker, it seems to me that has gone. That train's left the station. And if you look at the work being done by think tanks like American Compass, and if anyone is interested, in a kind of quasi-academic way in what's going on in America at the moment, I really do. There's a guy called Hon Cass who actually worked for Romney, but that kind of put that to one side. He accepts that all of that is over, and through American Compass and quite a lot of other think tanks and thinkers on the right in American politics, there is this sense now: how do we use that Trump energy? That the way he got through to people, the language, the words he used, like American carnage, which made all the kind of nice smelling people at the inauguration ceremony think, what on earth is he on about? But actually really did mean something to people who are living through a kind of carnage and felt that they were. And that if that energy can be turned into something, and actually, Caroline, what they want to turn it into, these people, is blue labor. Weirdly, because it's getting rid of the idea of government being the enemy, that kind of Reagan thing. It's moving beyond that and saying, actually, what we want is community. What we want is government spending, though we want it done sensibly. We're not afraid of those things. Those things that actually, if Trump had been a bit more disciplined, could perhaps have worked for his presidency. So it's a really interesting time to look at.
But their vacillation or even cowardice does vindicate Caroline's analysis that the establishment part of the Republican Party isn't acting with any confidence, because post the election, in a way, the most fascinating political battle on earth is the battle for control of the Republican machinery. And still, there are some few early indications. What does the big money do, and how does it mount its challenge to try and take back the main official positions within the RNC, for example, and at state level, to try and take back control of the party? But the risk for them, surely, is that if they get that wrong, then Trump or someone like Trump, think of Tucker Carlson, for example, of Fox News, someone like that decides to become the leader of the Trump tribe or a member of the Trump family. And then, as you know, from American politics with Teddy Roosevelt and breakaway, third party candidates like Ross Perot, you can then do huge damage to the party for at least one election cycle just by standing and winning 10 or 15 million votes. So they're in a very, very difficult position. Now, I'm conscious that we've talked so much, and you've been so fascinating that we have got almost to the end, and we haven't got to any audience questions, and there were loads. So I'm just going to whiz through a few. Really good question from David Landsman, which I'm going to put to you, Caroline. Do you see COVID in the UK and the West in general leading to a change in public perceptions of risk? Will we see 2020 as hysteria, not to be repeated, or will we from now on take a much more cautious approach to public health?
I think we will rethink where public health fits into how we think about our NHS and health. And to be honest, as a former public health minister, it often is the poor relation when it comes to our health service, because I think it is going to make us think more. I think more than that, I think it's, and we've touched on the economy, how we work is going to be, I think, a feature going forward as well, and what impact that has on how we live our lives. And actually there could be some positives out of that as well for many people. But no, I don't think we should think that this year has been one of hysterics or hysteria. I think we were facing a mortal enemy in the form of this virus. What we need to do is take learning from it so we can be more confident and more prepared for another virus coming down the road, because the truth is there's likely to be one.
To Lynton Crosby, question from Joseph Oscar. A question on the polling in the US election. Well, firstly, was the polling wrong? And do you believe pollsters missed again the real numbers because of the highly inflammatory rhetoric which intimidated the public, so people were reluctant to give an honest answer about voting for Trump?
Well, there's a lot of factors involved. Firstly, the problem today is that polls are being used for a purpose they originally weren't intended. That is, they're just another part of the media suite of commentary. On the one hand, they're used by the participants in elections to try to create and position their own candidate or party. So the way polls are used has changed. I wrote about this, and you can find an article about it on our company website if you're interested, because there's a lot to it. There's certainly some flaws in some of the methodologies, because, for example, they underweighted non-college educated white women and things like that, which have meant, particularly on online samples, which have meant they haven't got a true picture on occasion. But polls are just a mathematical tool based on certain assumptions. And they're not the great oracle that people have sort of created them to be now. And also they've become a proxy for the media to go out and actually understand what people are thinking. Those blue collar workers that people talk about, they sort of, people tend to say the polls say this, therefore they must be so. And so they misuse the polls. And there's a big difference between the polls political parties use to diagnose what and how people are thinking and then respond to that, and the sort of pop quiz polls that have now grabbed the landscape in the public debate. So partly there's a flaw in methodology. Polls are being used for reasons they weren't intended. They're only a mathematical model. They're only as good really as the people who interpret them. And they shouldn't be ascribed the sort of mythical status that they've come to be given in some quarters.
So it wouldn't be a review of 2020 without a question about Dominic Cummings. So Justin, the question from William McCarthy is, what does the panel make of Dominic Cummings? Which is a pretty broad brush question, really, isn't it?
I think that's one for Sebastian, isn't it? It's not one for me. I never met the fella.
Yeah. He's a fascinating character. Lynton Crosby, what do you make of Dominic Cummings?
Well, I've met him twice, I think. I'm sure he has his views of the world, but those in the back room should stay in the back room is my motto.
Caroline, he's sort of the anti-hero of the year, isn't he? He's the person. He's the person of the year.
He's done wonders for Northeast tourism, I understand. But look, I think part of the problem with him, I've never met the guy, but he was becoming a major distraction. He should be behind the scenes doing whatever he does. He shouldn't become the story itself. And it just also goes to show that in politics, as in other parts of life, nobody is indispensable.
He is having tangled with him several times down the years, but I have respect for him. He is an extraordinary insurgent campaigner, but it doesn't necessarily translate to government. Once you've blown everything up, people then want to know what you're putting in its place, and that stuff is really difficult. Government is difficult. We've got a question for Seb, which is it's kind of investor's question, really, from Dominic, which is, what are the sectors to look out for in 2021?
Interesting one. So the markets have been all over the place, but I think we are going to see a real resurgence for when people are able to spend their money on the things that they're so long to. So those companies and sectors that have been able to bridge the gap and find their niches in the new normal will perform like no other. And there will be a lot more money swinging into the kind of leisure activities that have been put on hold for so long. What I think's been a real notable feature so far is two factors. One, the biggest outperformance this year has been from the kind of mega stocks. So the top 10 companies in the world have stretched further and further away in terms of the value from the rest of the market. And that's really playing to this kind of superstar firm theory, which the pandemic has given further credence to. And then secondly, those firms that have been able to take advantage of the real step change in digitization, which won't do anything like reverse through what we've experienced. I think they'll be extremely well placed to profit from this.
Yeah. So we had loads of, just to whiz through quickly, I had great questions on what happened in Bristol Harbour and Black Lives Matter. We shouldn't have time to get to. We've loads of stuff on Boris and the Tory party. Several people wanting to know about the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which particularly seem to hate.
It's going to go, I think.
It's going to go. I think it's had it. And would you think that's a good thing? You think that's a good thing, Caroline?
Well, I have to say, it's one of those pieces of legislation that we brought it in and never really used it. In fact, they've had every reason to not use it. Yes. I've had more votes about unpicking the Fixed Term Parliament Act before I lost my seat last year than on anything. So I think it's longevity isn't its future.
Yeah. So, and then also brilliant questions on China, rise of China and Biden and China and sort of reorganization of the West, and stuff on big tech as well. But I'm just going to ask you all one last question, which is, what are your hopes, bit of optimism, hopes and expectations for 2021? Lynton first.
Well, first hope is that the vaccine works, people can get it, and we can get through it, and we can return to, well, you never return to normalcy, the world always changes, but that we can get the economy back on an even keel. And the reason I say the economy is because ultimately a strong economy is the foundation for people's well-being, and so that's what I hope for, and I hope that we can see that some of the sort of the power of technology that's been demonstrated, digitization and so forth, that's been demonstrated in the context of responding to this pandemic, actually becomes a force for good and doesn't just ultimately entrench more power in the hands of the technology giants who deserve their comeuppance sooner rather than later, I suspect.
Yeah, it's a good hope. Seb Burnside.
Yeah, I think the great hope for me for 2021 is that with 3/4 of the world's GDP and 2/3 of its emissions now covered by countries that have net zero targets, that we move from talking about grand targets and putting the policies into action to start to make meaningful impacts on the emissions that the world produces.
Caroline, your hopes for next year?
Well, firstly, I hope we have an amazing take-up of the vaccine. I really wish everybody involved with that the very best, so we can get 75, 80% take-up and really, get a grip of this. That is my first wish. Secondly, is that we take from the pandemic confidence that when needs must, we can do stuff. We can really do big stuff.
Yeah.
And to that end, I hope that actually in creating wealth for the future, we relook at making sure manufacturing made in Britain is much more part of our economy, because I think therein lies better jobs in our towns as well, which speaks to some of the discontent we've had in this country, similar to what they've had in America. So vaccine, manufacturing, that's what I want to see in 2021.
Justin Webb, your hopes for 2021?
I hope we can go offline. I hope we can talk to each other more. I mean, what we're doing now is wonderful, but I'm not allowed to have a view on these things, but I kind of echo what Lynton says. The whole tech world has. You look at what there was an Obama advisor the other day saying that accusing Facebook of doing kind of more damage to democracy than anything else, and I don't know whether or not that's true, but I do think there is a kind of, it's really obvious to me as a broadcaster when you meet people. I'm walking my dog in the park. People have views on everything. They have views on Brexit, one way or the other. They have views on politics, but they're just decent people who just want to have a conversation. We're kind of lost in this maelstrom of nonsense online where people are filled with hatred. And my God, you must come across this, Caroline, a lot more than I have. And it feels to me like a moment where when we do pick ourselves up and we get the vaccine and all the rest of it, I hope we're kinder to each other. I also hope the British Lions tour of South Africa goes ahead.
That's a great note on which to finish. And I have to say, you put that brilliantly, Justin, because that was the inspiration when we first started planning Answertime, which we're hoping in the spring when we can all actually, meet and hold a live event. Real people. There'll be drinks and
wow.
conversation. Just imagine it. That and we thought we'd start with some events online, but the whole impetus was, can we have a civilized and constructive, interesting conversation, which all four of you have done that brilliantly. So thank you for being our guests on this launch issue of Answertime. Thank you to our brilliant panel, to our subscribers for joining, and to NatWest Group for supporting this event. And until next year, have a very Merry Christmas.